All right, welcome to Transgender 101, put on by Envision New Mexico, UNM's school-based health center organization. This slide is really just our disclosure and accreditation policies. Give you a second just to read that and take it in. And our presentation today is called Transgender 101. And essentially we call this Transgender 101 just because this is the most basic information that we can give about trans folks. In this case, we're going to give some additional information about transgender students in schools, some of the things that they're going through. But still, this is limited to some basic terminology and basic information. So my name is Adrian Lawyer. I'm the co-director and the co-founder of the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. Not a lot of folks know that there is a Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. So we're always delighted to be able to reach a new audience and let you know that we exist, we're here. We've been around since 2008. There are three main areas to the work that we do. The first is this type of education. We've done some version of a Transgender 101 presentation almost 800 times all over the state of New Mexico and every region of the state, and also have been delighted and privileged to be invited to present in other parts of the country as well. So we've trained a lot of educators, a lot of clinicians, and these days we're training a lot of people who work in criminal justice. So we've trained the judicial conclave here in New Mexico, the district attorneys, the public defenders, pretrial services. We've trained two entire police forces, which are the police departments of Farmington and Artesia, New Mexico. And we've trained in many of the prisons around the state and continue to do that. So we are always happy to reach every different audience, and especially those who work with young trans folks, young transgender students in schools. The second thing that we do is advocacy work. So we were instrumental in the process, 5-year process to get Albuquerque Public Schools to adopt trans student policies, which they finally have done. And we also do advocacy work for individual trans people, just helping people come out to their families or at school or work, or helping people just go to a doctor's appointment or their name change hearing if they feel they need an advocate for that. And then finally, we have an actual center. So we provide direct services from our drop-in center in Albuquerque, at Jackson and Copper. We have a website, tgrcnm.org, if you want to know more. And my contact info will be on the final slide as well. So don't hesitate to contact me offline if there's anything that we can do for a transgender person that you know, or the family of a transgender person that you know. Here are some of the objectives we're gonna work on today. Just identifying definitions of transgender, understanding the difference between assigned sex at birth and gender, and then coming to some understanding about the ways that transgender people experience discrimination and even physical violence in our society right now. So for us, it's important that transgender is understood to mean a person whose internal gender differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the opposite. For some trans folks like myself, my internal gender and my assigned sex are absolutely what we would term opposites. But there are a lot of transgender people, and I think especially a growing group of people under the age of 35 who identify in a way that we would term non-binary. So the gender binary is the theory that there are only two genders, male and female, and that every single person can be sorted into one of those two categories. But with nearly 8 billion people on Earth, there are almost never two kinds of people. So we're very attached to the idea that there are two kinds of people, but really in almost every different category, there are more than two kinds of people. And we'll see that throughout this presentation, but we can see it all over life as well. There's just always a more complex version than two flavors. So for us, opposite is not a word we use when we talk about the definitions. Also, it's important for us that our definition, our working definition right now, not include medical treatments. So again, as the presenter today and as a transgender man myself, I have undergone some medical treatments to actualize myself, including hormone replacement therapy for about 13 years now and surgery on my chest. So for me, those things were really critical parts of my journey. I really had an antagonistic and painful relationship with my body prior to transition. And for me, doing those medical things helped me to care about myself and love myself and take care of myself in a new way. I'm the parent of a 12-year-old kid, so I really want to live as long as I can. But prior to my transition, I definitely did not treat my body like living a long time was a priority for me. I was very self-destructive and abusive and did a lot of things that were not super healthy because of how much pain I was in inside my own body. So for me, medical things were a really critical turning point. But for some trans folks, they just don't feel that they need medical treatment, or they would love to have medical treatment and they can't figure out how to access it. So we have a lot of referrals we can provide to people in Albuquerque and even Santa Fe. But if a transgender person calls from Roswell and is looking for hormone replacement therapy, we don't really have a single doctor right now that we know to refer people to. So we're working on creating more access and training more people all around the state. But there's a lot of reasons that people either don't want to or are not able to access medical treatments. So for us, that also can't be part of a working definition. So it just very simply means a person who has some type of misalignment, some type of disagreement between the sex they were assigned as a baby and the gender that they feel internally. So the word transgender is a great word for non-transgender people to use, and trans is also totally non-offensive. It is just shorthand for transgender. So I'll probably even unconsciously just say trans throughout this presentation because it's just a shortened version and completely non-offensive. One of the most important things to understand about the word transgender or trans is that it's an adjective, so it has to describe another word, a noun. So transgender students, my transgender colleague, my transgender friend at my church, all are fine, but we don't call a person a transgender. We don't call the group of people the transgenders because it's just really disrespectful, and also it's very reductive. It sort of objectifies people and says the only thing that you are is a transgender person, instead of being a complex human being who has a lot of different identities inside of you, and one of those things is trans, having the attribute of being trans. So we just make sure that we always use the word transgender to describe, to describe something, not use it as a noun. Or also, sort of funny, I've heard people use it as a verb. So I've had people say to me, like, what year did you start transgendering? Which is always a little bit funny. But I try to understand that folks are just really doing the best they can to talk about this, and they may not have heard the terms that we use. So the verb that trans people use when we do anything like seek out medical treatment or change our names or change our documents or come out to folks is transition. So we know we don't corner the market on that term, but that is a word that trans people pretty exclusively use to mean doing anything around actualizing ourselves and our gender. So a transgender man, which is what I am, is a person who's assigned female at birth, but who knows their internal gender to be male. And certainly there's no one story for transgender men or transgender women or other non-binary transgender people. There's not one story that describes our life experiences. So there are a lot of people like me who feel that they knew their gender very early. For me, I always say that I knew this around the age of 2. So as soon as I knew I was a person, I knew that I was a boy. But I also found out really quickly that my parents and caregivers were not bought into that idea at all. When I said to them, hey, I'm a boy, they said, you're not a boy, don't say that. And so I knew I had a complex situation going on there. But I've also known transgender men who didn't really come to their understanding of it until much later in life as adults. So there's no right or wrong way to be transgender or to understand yourself as a transgender person. There are more common narratives, but that doesn't make them correct or incorrect if somebody does or doesn't sort of fit that story. A transgender woman, so some famous transgender women that you may have heard of are Caitlyn Jenner and Laverne Cox. So a transgender woman is a person who was assigned male at birth, but who knows herself to be female internally, who knows her gender to be female. And for us, it seems almost there's a feeling of this almost being a silly thing to have to explain transgender man and transgender woman, but I've done this presentation hundreds of times, and I've seen that people do feel some confusion about which one is a transgender man and which one is a transgender woman. So to us, this seems very obvious, very plain, that I am a man and I am transgender makes me a transgender man. So for us, the assignment at birth is certainly a significant factor in our lives, but is not the way we think of ourselves or center ourselves or describe ourselves. So for me, I've always known myself to be male. Now I am fully actualized as a male person in the world and in the culture that I live in. So I would never go back and refer to myself as a transgender woman, which really puts at the center the sex I was assigned at birth. Or for me, that certainly is something that I can't get away from. It's not something that I deny or even really want to get away from necessarily, but it's not the way I would talk about myself or lead with that type of language as being female or a girl or a woman, because I've always known myself to be male. So a transgender man is a man who's transgender, right? So this is a term that not a lot of folks have heard before, and it's the word cisgender. So transgender people actually came up with this word. Trans and cis are both Latin prefixes. They're oppositional prefixes like pre and post. Trans means crossing over, and cis means lined up on one side. So a lot of times nurses are people who've heard these prefixes because these are used in chemistry a lot. So nurses are one of the rare groups that I talk to have maybe been exposed to the prefixes trans and cis, not in this context, but at least I've heard those terms before, those prefixes before. So for us, this is a word that just means that you are not transgender. I often joke with audiences that if you've never heard the word cisgender, you probably are cisgender, which is not something to be upset at all about. In fact, it comes with a degree of privilege in our culture. Cisgender people just have a lot of things that they don't ever have to think about or consider that for transgender people can sometimes feel like daily fears or even gauntlets that we have to run, like just trying to figure out how to use a restroom. So for cisgender people, if you're in a public setting and feel the need to use the restroom, most of the time cisgender folks just look around and find a public restroom and use it. And it never occurs to them to question whether they'll be allowed to use it, whether they could have an encounter with law enforcement for using the restroom, be assaulted by another person in the restroom, be called out of the restroom by someone else, be told they don't belong there. So for transgender people, that's enough of a fear that for a lot of us, we learn to not use the restroom too much unless we're at our own homes or in a very safe place. Transgender students in schools report things to us like actually not drinking water all day at school so that they don't then have to navigate using the bathroom at school. So as you can imagine, that means we're not just talking about discriminatory experiences, we're talking about real health disparities around urinary tract issues, bladder issues, or kidney issues when young people aren't drinking water and aren't eliminating. So these are real serious health concerns that stem from discrimination and fear of discrimination and violence that cisgender people don't really have to contend with. So for us, the word cisgender is important because it's really introducing a value neutral term to talk about those people who are not transgender. So in the past, the term that's typically used instead of cisgender is normal. For example, a person is either transgender or normal. And what we would like to start hearing more and more is that a person is either transgender or cisgender. And I do recognize that this does set up another binary system, right? That the idea that there's two kinds of people, either just transgender or just cisgender. So I allow that there's more complexity than that. With 8 billion people, there are no two categories that hold us all, and there are plenty of folks who maybe don't identify as either cisgender or transgender, and that's fine. This is not an attempt to sort everybody into two categories. It is really more an attempt to have a value neutral term to talk about people who are not transgender. So for instance, another example of this would be that we have the word straight. So a person can either be gay or straight, or certainly a multitude of other things like bisexual or asexual or however they identify. But the word straight is meant to take the place also of normal, because we know now that it is normal to be gay. It is a minority attribute. And we feel the same way about being transgender. As of right now, there is no major demographic tool that allows people to identify as transgender. So on the census, you cannot be counted as a transgender person. There is no question that asks that information of people. So really, we don't have great population estimates on trans people around the world or in the United States or here in New Mexico, Bernalillo County, Albuquerque. We really don't have those numbers because there's nobody actually counting trans people. But as we get better and more reliable estimates on the trans population, we feel like we're looking at least 1%. So the most recent report that came out of the Williams Institute put the trans population of the US around 0.8%. So as these numbers get better, we get closer to 1%, and I believe we're going to even end up over that when we get real counts of trans people. So if 1 in 100 people are transgender, that's a normal human variation. It's just a way that people come. It's a minority attribute. So some other examples, and even another minority attribute that's around 1 in 100 is red hair. When we have minority traits as human beings, we tend to start off in a place of really great fear of that trait and the people who hold that trait. So for instance, redheaded people were identified as witches. When we go back to like the Salem witch trials, we identified red-haired people as witches and then either drowned them or crushed them with rocks because the red hair was enough to identify the person as a witch. And these days, we certainly don't do that to red-haired people. Red-haired people may still experience being different in different ways in our culture, but we don't kill red-haired people just for having red hair. We don't deny them jobs on the basis of red hair, or deny them a lease on an apartment, or refuse them health care. These are all things that transgender people are still experiencing today with a minority attribute that's about the same incident rate as red hair. Another example that I think of is left-handedness, and that's an even much more recent example of a group we were very afraid of and very cruel towards just for having a minority trait. So children who were left-handed had their hands tied behind their backs at school by their teachers, things that we would think were unconscionable to do now. To tie a child's hand behind its back in school to force that child to be right-handed is something we would not consider doing today, but was done with the blessing and encouragement of parents not even 50 years ago. So this is something where we even said left-handed people were possessed by the devil. We said that that they couldn't be trusted, that they needed to be corrected into being right-handed. Even the word sinister that we still right now use to mean sort of evil the Latin root word is left. So it was a word that was really used to describe left-handed people. And now we've lost that connotation, but we still use the term. And it came into being because of our discriminatory practices towards left-handed people. And now folks don't really even remember that we did that, especially young people. When I train people who are high school age or younger, they actually don't believe me when I start listing off the things we did to left-handed people. They're like, we didn't ever do that. And I have to say, let's look it up on the internet because this is true. Let's do some research and let you see that we actually did punish people just for having the dominant hand of left instead of right. So these are all things that trans folks are still experiencing, things like being said we're possessed by the devil, or that we should be corrected, or that there's some type of therapy that could fix us. That still is stuff that we're experiencing, where we've already left that mindset behind around left-handed people. So for us, cisgender is a very real attempt to introduce value-neutral language to help along the evolutionary process of coming to see this as just a minority attribute, which is value-neutral, instead of something that we have to feel so much fear about, so much anxiety about. If we have language that talks about you and talks about me, that sounds both without value, transgender and cisgender, we're helping to bring about the day that we will just not feel the need to harm folks who are trans and just allow them to integrate into our culture like left-handed people. In fact, left-handed people certainly live in a right-handed world even now, but even more we have left-handed can openers, left-handed guitars, left-handed notebooks, a lot of left-handed accommodations. We've had a left-handed president for the last 8 years. So these are all things that were unthinkable 50 years ago, 75 years ago, but now we're really accommodating left-handedness the best we can and not treating it as something that is a problem or needs to be corrected or needs to be feared. So what is assigned sex at birth? That certainly is a question I get a lot, and why do we call it that? And for us, it's very similar to the term cisgender. For us, there's an emotional component to not just referring to this as sex. And there's a philosophical component too, which is to really separate out the idea that the sex we're assigned at birth is synonymous with our gender. And I think culturally, that's one of the things that we're trying to tease apart in our training, is just coming to understand that a person's internal gender and the sex that they were assigned at birth may not be the same. Now, for a lot of people, if 1% of people are trans, then 99% of people are cisgender and do have an agreement between these two things. But for us, it's very important to understand that the upcoming 4 attributes that we're going to talk about are 4 distinct, separate pieces of all of us as human beings. So those 4 attributes are going to be assigned sex at birth, internal gender, external gender expression, and then sexual orientation. So for us, it's very critical to understand those 4 things as separate threads for each individual human being that may or may not agree, especially the 3 gender pieces, may be in total alignment or may not be in alignment at all, even between the 3. So we're going to break those out starting with assigned sex. So for us, saying things like biological sex sound a little too deterministic and a little bit too reductive, like just deal with it, that's the sex you were born with, and so that's what you are, just kind of get over it. But there's almost a dysphoric component to just not agreeing with the sex you were assigned at birth. And for me, again, I knew this at 2 years old, so I don't know what could have, I don't even know how to explain that. I talk about this and think about it a lot, and I really don't know how to explain what I knew at 2, but I know now that I was right the whole time, and I still know that it's deeply important to me, my gender, and for most of you watching, it probably is also important to you. So even if I were on a desert island, I would want to be able to take my hormones, and I would think of myself as male, even if I never interacted with another human being. So for most of us, gender is sort of a core component to our identity, and it's important that we have it acknowledged by others. So for us, I don't feel that I was born a girl, which is what some people have said to me. I was assigned female at birth, but I was born a transgender man. I was born the same person that I am today. So I wasn't a girl then and now I'm a boy. I was always this person, a transgender male, from day one. That's why for us the language is really crucial. And the assignment at birth thing is really that is who does it, right? The baby is not participating in this assignment. It's the adults in the room when a baby is born who assign the baby, usually male or female. But let's talk about even that, right? I say that there are never 2 kinds of people, and here's another very crucial example of the fact that there are not 2 kinds of people in the world. Even biologically being assigned male or female at birth does not encompass everybody. There are folks known as intersex. This used to sometimes be called hermaphrodite. We have now been taught by intersex people that they do not want to be called hermaphrodites. That is thought of as a pejorative term now. So the word that intersex folks are using is intersex, and that's what they have asked us to also use. Sometimes clinically, you'll see this referred to as differences of sex development, or DSD. I think previously that stood for disorders of sex development, so that was also a very touchy thing for intersex people. The idea that there's something pathological or that this represents a condition, a medical condition, is very touchy, when again, what we're talking about is normal human variation. And intersex, the incident rate of intersex has also been compared to red hair in a paper from the United Nations that you can look up online that talks about this. Again, we're looking at about the same number of people as have red hair. So if we don't think of red hair as an abnormality, then we should not think of the differences in all of our bodies as an abnormality either. And the real truth is that all of our bodies look totally different. So I don't think that we are exposed to a lot of other humans' bodies without clothes on in most of our lives. I have not been in my 46 years exposed to a lot of other naked human beings. So it's easy then to imagine that people's bodies sort of look similar or the same underneath their clothes, when that's just not true. We look as different in our genitals as we do in our faces. So intersex people are really just part of the fabric, part of the tapestry of human difference, not in some special group way over here, away from the males and females who are over here. So I think we really need to understand this as just normal human variation also. And sometimes a person who's intersex can be identified at birth. It makes it very hard to assign them into the category of male or female. But there are also intersex people who don't know that they are intersex until puberty. Sometimes it has more to do with hormonal absorption and things. So it doesn't really emerge that the person is intersex until puberty. There are intersex people who live their whole lives without knowing they're intersex, because this can be very subtle or very, what some people would term minor. So if these are very minor or subtle differences in the person's body, they may not ever know this about themselves. There certainly are people who have mosaic genetics and live their whole lives without ever knowing that. So intersex can be something we identify at birth, or it may not be. So it just simply means a person whose body in some way is different from what we call typically male or typically female. And even here, this is a portion of a definition that came from the Intersex Society of North America, which is also a terrific website if you want to learn more about intersex. The ISNA, Intersex Society of North America, has a lot of really rich resources on their website. And even there, the definition is old enough to say a variety of conditions, right? So even here we see that. And really we're moving more and more away from any language that feels like it's pathologizing this. So here are just some examples of a way that a person can be intersex. And this is really challenging because, again, this is really just normal human variation. This is a minority trait that some people have and others don't have. But we are so committed to the idea that there are two kinds of people that we frequently do medical modifications on babies that are identifiably intersex. And that can include things like doing surgery on their genitals within just a few days of being born. Now, intersex people grow up and they're not happy that this was done to them. In fact, usually they're really upset and angry and feel that they were harmed as babies and come back later and say, why did you do this to me? I don't understand why you hurt me this way when there was nothing wrong with me. In fact, intersex activists are trying all around the world to make these surgeries illegal with varying degrees of success. So far, the countries of Chile and Malta have outlawed these surgeries at the urging of intersex activists. So the fact that we're still doing this in the United States, we can't possibly kid ourselves that we do this for the baby when the babies have grown up and said, we really want you to stop doing it. So we have to acknowledge that we do this for our own sense of comfort and our own really sort of unhealthy attachment to that gender binary. We're not comfortable when a baby doesn't fit into the gender binary. In fact, one of the only things we ask a stranger about their baby is your baby a boy or a girl? Which is, to me, as I said, I think about this stuff and talk about it all the time. So for me, that's really become a really interesting ritual that we do with people that we don't even know. Because essentially what we're asking, if you come to understand assigned sex and gender as two different things, what we're really going up to people we don't know and asking is, what's the assigned sex of your baby? Or in other words, what genitals does your baby have? What type of genitals does your baby have? Which if we think about being at a park on a Saturday afternoon, talking to a stranger, that becomes sort of an inappropriate question, like, why do I need to know what that little baby's body looks like underneath its clothes? And I think about this because my mom answered that question about me when I was pre-verbal, and anybody who asked her, she told them that I was a girl, and she was wrong. So what she was really telling people, strangers, was what my body looked like, what my private parts looked like as a baby, which I think it seems like a radical thing, but why can't a baby's private parts be private? Just because the baby is a baby doesn't mean we need to go around talking about its body in that way. We don't think we are talking about its body, of course. We think we're talking about its internal gender. But my case is a really good one to illustrate the fact that we really need to separate those things out. We can't tell the gender of a baby until the baby can tell us. Because the people who took care of me were surprised to hear that my gender did not line up with my assigned sex at birth, but it doesn't, and it didn't. So for me, it's really important that we think about the way we talk about and treat babies. And that really becomes the bottom line, is that we want to know the perceived gender of the baby because it affects the way we treat the baby. So one of the studies that I always have to talk about is a study called Baby X. So they brought a baby into an adult subject and they said, this baby's a girl. And they handed over the baby to the research subject who was an adult. And the subjects almost all picked up the baby with their arms wrapped around the baby like this. And they held the baby really close to their body and were wrapping it around and not letting it feel that there was a drop here. And when we're told the baby's a girl, the most interesting and subtle piece of this is that we're putting its face really close to my face. Because if the baby is perceived to be a girl, we already want to be teaching that baby like intimate interpersonal communication. We want the baby to start reading my facial expressions and micro expressions, interpreting how I feel, understanding how I feel. So the best thing about the study is that then they brought back in the same baby So the baby never changed. It was always the same baby. But this time they came in and said the baby's a boy and handed it over. And almost universally, the research subjects picked up the baby like this with two hands around the ribs, out away from their body, and sometimes even kind of jostled the baby a little bit like, hey, little buckaroo, like played with it in a way that was sort of rougher, right? But it was always the same baby. So the fact that we treat babies differently, whether we think that they're male or female, is interesting because it doesn't even matter. Not one person in the study thought to check the baby's diaper or check the baby's body to see if it was how we actually define male and female biologically. They just took the person's word for it and then changed the way they treated the baby entirely based on their perception of the gender of the baby. And I think, to me, that's interesting right now in history, because I train a lot of different groups of people, and I have yet to walk into a group of people where there weren't men and women doing these same jobs. So I train police officers, male and female. I train correctional officers, male and female. I know that on the ranches around New Mexico, the women are all doing the same level of very hard physical work as the men, and usually being asked to fix the food as well and clean up the food as well, and do a large portion of the child rearing too. So for me, it makes me question the idea that we have sex segregated division of labor in our culture very much anymore. So I don't know what we think we're preparing babies for by differentiating the way we treat them based on gender. I don't necessarily believe that there are no innate differences between men and women or boys and girls, but I don't know for sure. And I feel like it's something that we should at least question and ask ourselves before we just continue to treat boys and girls in this vastly different way in a society like ours, where we see a lot of poor outcomes from doing that as well. In our society, we see a really rampant problem with violence against women. We see a really rampant problem in substance abuse and mental health stuff. So I'm wondering if some of the stuff we do with kids when they're little, it might not be contributing to some of those things. So it's worth at least asking questions about how we treat babies and children. For me, one of the very interesting things we're doing these days is what's called gender reveal parties, which I've come to understand is really like the baby's body reveal parties, where we gather our friends and family around before a baby's even born to tell the genitals of the fetus that has not yet been born. And the reason we do this is so that our friends and family can start to color the baby's world and buy pink or blue things for the baby that has not even come out and joined us yet. So we put a high premium on this information, but why do we? And to me, it's just an open-ended question. I think it's something worth thinking about and talking about. So if assigned sex is really just the genitals that you're born with, which is what it is, we assign a newborn baby male or female based on the presence of a typical identifiable penis or vulva, then what is gender? For us, there are two components to gender. Really three, because I think assigned sex at birth is one of the three pieces that make up our gender. So the second piece is what we call just gender, the internal gender, as separate from sex. So assigned sex is physical, it's physiological. Gender is internal. It's just our own sense of ourselves as male or female. And like I said, I knew this about myself at the age of 2. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has actually released a statement that most of us know our gender, and it remains relatively fixed from the age of 4. So by the age of 4, most kids know whether they think of themselves as boys or girls, and it usually is a very deeply held identity piece, even for young kids. And with cisgender kids, with non-trans kids, if they reached the age of 4 and couldn't tell us their gender, we would probably suspect that there might be a developmental delay or some type of cognitive problem if a 4-year-old kid can't just report, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. But if a 4-year-old child who's trans says, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, one of the first things we say to them societally is, you're too young, you don't know. Or you're too young to make that decision. Where for us, it doesn't feel like a decision any more than it does for cisgender people. It feels like we're just reporting a very, very deeply important part of ourselves, but we're met with this idea that we're trying to make a decision that we're not equipped to make, or that we're too young to make. So I think one of the things for us is just starting to respect trans children when they report this stuff, especially because with young children, there are no medical interventions that are needed. All we're talking about doing is listening to what they say about themselves that feels very important to them and treating them in accordance with what they're saying. So frequently it just means using the right pronouns and calling the child by a different name that's not the wrong gender. And for a lot of kids, that really staves off a lot of really big problems. So young transgender children who don't get listened to usually show a lot of uncontrolled depression. So they turn it inwards and they're very deeply depressed, even as very young kids, or they show a lot of uncontrolled rage if they're the type of kid to turn it out instead. And what seems to make a difference is just hearing what they're saying about themselves and respecting what they're saying about themselves. And this does not mean we have to get into a lot of complicated medical stuff. It just means listening and respecting. So internal gender is something that most of us know from the age of 4. And again, most of us identify cis and trans as male or female, but there are not two kinds of people in any of these categories. So there certainly are people who identify in a way that we would call non-binary, in a way that's not simply male or simply female. And I know that gender, the internal gender, is invisible because I know some trans people who hide their internal gender. And I think in a culture like ours that sees so much violence against women, it's often transgender women who feel that they have to suppress their internal gender. So this person is assigned male at birth. They live their lives sort of in disguise as male, but they know every second of every day that they are women on the inside. So I know that this is not something that you can look at somebody and see. It does not always track with the assigned sex at birth or the gender expression. So for me, these two pieces are now lined up. My gender expression and my internal gender are lined up and only are not matched with my assigned sex at birth. But I know some trans people who have other pieces that mix and match that way. So why does this matter? I think it matters because we make a lot of assumptions about people's gender based on how they look, and we're frequently wrong. And so there's a number of things that we may or may not do with that information. For me individually, one of the things that it's helped me to do is to stop using so much gendered language in my day-to-day life. I'm much more likely to say my spouse or my partner rather than my wife, even though my partner is a cisgender woman. I don't usually use gendered terms for her. And with my child, I say child or kid or kiddo way more than I say son, even though he's a boy and I use male pronouns for him. I try to steer clear of more gendered language. I'm also a Southerner. I'm from the southeastern United States. So I was very much taught to say, indoctrinated basically, to call everybody ma'am or sir, no matter who they were to me or what interaction we were having. And these days I really just hold back on that type of thing. I think there are a lot of ways that we can be kind and authentic and warm with people without using those types of honorifics, especially since I know that there are people who walk around getting called sir every day, and it really hurts them a lot. And it's not the fault of the cashier who can't see that person's gender. They're just going on what they can see. But now that I know you can't see it, I'm a little more reluctant to just call people ma'am and sir unless I really know them and know that they would be charmed to hear that term. So that's just one example of what we can do when we kind of realize that this is not as obvious as we think it is. But for me, mainly, it's just acknowledging that it's not always obvious. What is obvious, what we can see, is gender expression. So that's all the stuff that we do that telegraphs gender to people around us. So that can be clothing, hairstyles, jewelry, facial hair, makeup, speech, gait, carriage, everything. And I really think that this is also incorporating of cultural norms and expectations, which is where this gets the most interesting to me, which is that there are no human universals around gender expression. There is not one single role or garment or behavior that is universally considered masculine or feminine among human beings. So in the United States, what we call a skirt in Scotland is sometimes called a kilt, and is a very masculine garment to wear. So a piece of fabric that wraps around your waist is not inherently feminine. It is based on who you are, where you are, and who raises you, whether you consider things to be masculine or feminine. In the dominant US culture, we are very well aware of the fact that short hair is considered masculine and long hair is considered feminine. But there are tribal cultures who are geographically situated right near us where long hair is considered to be a very masculine marker. So none of these things stay the same over time, and none of them are the same throughout all human cultures, which I think is really crucial. It is always going to change whether we want it to or mean for it to or not. So even in the dominant United States culture, one thing we've seen is the move from women not being allowed to wear pants and jeans to women now mainly wearing pants and jeans. or women were not allowed access to tons of different professions. Even 50 or 75 years ago, women were not judges or architects or engineers or surgeons or professional athletes or race car drivers or astronauts, and now they're all of those things. So gender norms and expectations do shift even within a culture, and across different cultures, they don't ever stay the same. Which again, to me, is really encouraging, because it means we can ask questions about these things and these expectations we have around gender, and we can change it. If it's going to change anyway, then we can take a more active role in changing some of the more destructive elements of our gender norms and expectations in our culture. For instance, it's very disheartening to me to realize that the most degrading thing that you can say to a male in our culture is any version of "you are female." If we say to a boy or a man, you're a woman, you do something like a woman, or you are slang for female genitalia, that is the most degrading, dehumanizing thing we can say. And what then does that say about all of us and how we think about women? If that is the most horrible insult we can deliver, then what are we saying? So for me, that's a big piece that we could look at and shift away from purposefully, rather than just waiting for things to change. So once again, and I think this is really important for people who work with young people, being transgender does not mean that you identify with simply male or female. It does not mean that you want to be constricted in that way. We are seeing a lot of young people under the age of 35 who are embracing identities and identity terms and expressions that are non-binary. So basically not just fitting into simple definitions of male or female. Now, completely separate from these three things, to me, your gender is comprised of your assigned sex at birth, your internal gender, and your gender expression. And that is completely separate from your sexual orientation, which really just describes who you are attracted to. Now, these days, folks are talking about attraction as even being broken down. Sexual attraction, romantic attraction, emotional attraction, these can actually be separate pieces for people. There are people who don't feel a lot of sexual attraction to any group of people. That's the word up here that says asexual, but they may feel a strong emotional or romantic attraction to women or men or some other type of grouping. So people are really starting to break this out into smaller pieces to describe their experience of attraction into more granular elements. But these are terms that most of us have heard of to describe sexual orientation. Gay, lesbian, straight, and bisexual are very common terms. Asexual, again, just refers to people who feel that they are sexual non-participants. So it doesn't mean over the course of their lifetime that they may not ever have sex, but they mainly describe it as being not driven by sexual attraction, not feeling strong, driving attractions to any group of people. Where pansexual folks say, you could not predict who I might feel a strong attraction to. For me, as an individual, Adrian, I have only ever been attracted to female aspected people. I don't know why that is. I can't explain it. All I can do is sort of report it. So in my lifetime, I've had the interesting experience of living for 20 years as a lesbian and as an adult, and now being seen by most of the world as straight when I'm still the same person and I've always had the same set of attractions. So it's interesting to think about how we label these things and what it means from a trans perspective. But so I can't describe myself as pansexual because I don't feel attraction to other men, transgender or cisgender. But a pansexual person would never say that. It could be any type of person that they are attracted to. It does not mean they are attracted to every person. It means there's no limit on the scope of attraction that way. And in fact, pansexual folks usually say things like, I really fell in love with that person because of their sparkly eyes, or because we had so much fun when we went to the movies that night and it was just a great time hanging out with them. So they don't even talk about it the way I just did, saying it's only women for me. They would never describe it that way. All right, so there are two surveys we're going to be referencing here over the next few slides. One is the National Trans Discrimination Survey. You can access this and the most recent updated version of it at transequality.org. And basically, this survey showed that transgender people are experiencing disproportionate discrimination and physical violence in every area of life. So that means when seeking medical care, in employment situations, housing, and certainly in educational settings. So trans folks reported twice the homelessness of the general population and twice the unemployment. For transgender people of color, the figure was 4 times the unemployment of the general population. So in every single measure, the discrimination and violence was worse for transgender women than transgender men, although transgender men do experience these things. It was disproportionate for trans women, and it was incredibly disproportionate for people of color versus white people. For us, this is really crucial to understand because this is where we talk about intersectional identity. And the more different oppressed identities one person holds, the more horrible their outcomes are going to be. So for me, I'm a white transgender man with a college degree. I'm a US citizen. I'm a monolingual native English speaker. I'm a parent. I'm coupled. Like when I walk through the world as a trans person, especially a person who can't be visually picked out as trans, I experience way less of these outcomes than my sisters who come to the drop-in center every day, who are generally young, native, transgender women who may not have finished high school, who may have been rejected by their families of origin, who may now be HIV positive, who may be dealing with substance use, even sort of chaotic use, and homelessness. So just being trans does expose you to discrimination and violence, but not as much as being trans and holding a lot of other oppressed identities at the same time in a culture that marginalizes these groups of people. So in a culture that still is racist and misogynistic, then certainly transgender women who are people of color are going to have worse outcomes than somebody like me who's a transgender man who's white. So this is one of the worst statistics, I think, from the survey. This is about lifetime suicide attempt rate. The question is actually, have you attempted suicide at least one time in your lifetime? For the general population, the positive response rate on that question across various survey tools is always lower than 5%. It's something like 4.6. And for our 6,500 respondents on this survey, it was 41% who admitted to at least one suicide attempt. And that means not thinking a lot about it or making a plan, but actually applying lethal means to your body and surviving. So this is a really crystallized statistic that shows a lot about how difficult it is to be trans and to face the outcomes that trans people are facing right now in our culture. Now this survey is from GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, and it centers on students who are in school right now. So the National Trans Survey asked a lot of questions about educational settings, but it asked it of people over the age of 18 to think back on the experiences they had in school. The GLSEN National School Climate Survey is given to students who are currently in school, describing their current experiences of school. And there was actually a special report that was pulled out about trans students, and the actual title they gave that report is Harsh Realities. So when they broke down the school climate survey for just trans respondents, the title of the report had to be Harsh Realities, because that's what it is like to be trans in school right now. So a third of transgender students reported hearing school staff make negative remarks about gay people, about women, whether they were LGBTQ or not, and about people's gender expression, which usually skews towards a person who's assigned male at birth having a gender expression that is deemed to be too feminine. Almost 90% of the students responding to the survey said that they had been verbally harassed within the past year because of either being gay or having a different atypical gender expression, or even just being perceived to be gay or trans. More than half of the transgender students who responded had experienced some type of physical harassment. So this means things like slapped, pushed, kicked. Roughly a quarter of the students had been physically assaulted in their school. One of the more terrifying pieces about this question is that this isn't just simply from peers or other young people, but also from adults in the school setting. So the adults who are there to keep you safe at school are sometimes the ones verbally harassing you or physically assaulting you. And when an adult in the school setting perpetrates on a student this way for trans students, the resulting suicide attempt rate is reported as 76%. So again, when adults who are in a place that are there to keep you safe are the ones who are turning the violence on you, it makes these kids' sense of being a person of worth go down to basically zero. And this is certainly something that transgender people know, but increasingly we're getting the data to show that we are having worse outcomes right now than folks who are, simply gay or lesbian or bisexual, who are also reporting a lot of negative outcomes. But for trans students, they're worse. It's more than even this group. And when verbal harassment is experienced, it's lowering the GPAs versus the students who aren't having even verbal harassment occur. And for gay and lesbian students, they're still able to keep it higher. This to me is a really big deal in a state like ours that's very concerned about graduation rates and students leaving school. One of the reasons we want students to graduate is so they can go on and have higher education experiences. And trans students with high levels of harassment report having no plans to pursue any education. A lot of the individual trans students that we've known over the years here in New Mexico have actually dropped out of high school because of the harassment they experienced there, frequently at the hands of adults. So not even being able to complete high school education, much less having plans to go on and pursue higher education. So here are some resources that might be helpful. We're in sort of a rapidly changing political climate right now, but the Title IX resources at the top of the page are still helpful. We have good case law still on Title IX, so we are hoping these protections will still be extended to these students. The current APS procedural directive around trans students in its entirety is the second link. The last one is just a really great resource guide about how to make trans inclusive schools without having to do things like any kind of build out or retrofitting of the facilities. Here are some great resources for trans students. Certainly we are there to help trans students and trans families in any way that we can. We would definitely urge them to contact us right away to see how we could plug in and help. Our friends at the New Mexico GSA network do a lot of great work with LGBTQ students and can be contacted around starting a GSA in a school that doesn't already have one. The Trevor Project is an organization that does suicide prevention just for LGBTQ youth, not even adults, just youth. So that's a really good resource to have. It's a great crisis hotline. And PFLAGs, this is the PFLAG Albuquerque chapter, but there are PFLAGs all over the state as well, which you can link to by going to the PFLAG Albuquerque website there. Here are our school nurse reviewers for the presentation. And this is my contact information. That is my email address and my mobile phone number. I hope you won't hesitate to contact me if there's any way that I can help you, any other questions that I can answer, or certainly if you need to refer a trans student or trans family to us, please don't hesitate to reach out.